9 hours and 14 minutes. That was all the red countdown clock above the war room had left when Marcus Vance turned toward the doorway and laughed. 7 days, $41. 6 million in frozen client contracts, and 20 of the highest-paid security engineers in the country. And the server that Aegis Sentinel had sold half the Fortune 500 as mathematically unbreakable was dying in front of every one of them, sealed shut by a ransomware strain no one in that glass tower had ever seen. They had tried everything they knew. They had nothing left. And the only person in the building no one had thought to ask was a quiet single father in a worn canvas jacket, holding the hand of his 7-year-old daughter and carrying a laptop so old its white plastic had yellowed at the corners. Marcus looked at the machine, then at the man, and smiled the way cruel men smile when they think they are being generous. "That thing couldn't load a weather page," he said. "But please, show the room what a $40 relic can do." No one standing there understood what they were looking at. Follow this story now. What that old laptop does in the next 10 minutes will undo everything you think you know about the experts you trust. Leo Calloway woke at 5:42 every morning, 8 minutes before the alarm he set out of habit and never needed. He did this in a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of Austin, in a building old enough that the radiators still ticked, and he did it quietly. Because the second bedroom that should have been his was instead a child's room with a paper galaxy taped to the ceiling. He gave the bedroom to his daughter the week they moved in. He slept on a fold-out in the living room, and he had never once mentioned it to anyone, because the arithmetic of that choice was the easiest he had ever done. His mornings ran on rails. He made oatmeal with exactly 1 spoon of brown sugar, because 2 was a celebration and they saved celebrations. He laid out Nora's clothes on the arm of the couch and let her believe she had chosen them. He packed her lunch in a steel tin that had a small dent on the lid. And the dent mattered, because the tin had been her mother's, and Nora liked to press her thumb into the dent before she ate, the way some people touch a door frame on the way out of a house. Nora was 7. She drew constantly, mostly machines that did not exist. A toaster that printed weather reports, a bicycle that ran on humming, and she narrated each invention to her father with total seriousness as though presenting to a board. Leo listened to everyone. He asked real questions. He never told her a single one of them was impossible, because he had spent a portion of his life being told that, and he remembered exactly how the word had felt landing. 3 years earlier, Nora's mother had died. Sarah had been an electrical engineer, quick and warm and impatient with anyone who confused confidence for competence, and she had been the one who first told Leo that the kindest thing you can do with what you know is give it away. She had been gone for 38 months. Leo still set out 2 coffee mugs some mornings before he caught himself, and he had stopped being embarrassed by it. To everyone at Aegis Sentinel Security, where Leo had worked for 14 months as a contract facilities and low-voltage technician, he was the man who fixed the badge readers and chased the ghost in the parking garage thermostat. He wore a gray polo with a vendor logo that was not the company's own. He ate lunch alone, usually outside, usually reading. He carried in a scuffed messenger bag a laptop that looked like it had been pulled out of a time capsule, a thick, off-white machine with a matte screen and physical buttons worn smooth in the wrong places, the keys for D, F, J, and K rubbed down to faint shadows. The engineers who noticed it at all assumed it was a junk machine he used for building systems. What none of them noticed was the way he read. When a wall of diagnostic text scrolled past a monitor, the kind of fast, dense output that made most people look away, Lizo's eyes did not flinch and did not skim. They moved down the column at a single steady speed and stopped every time on the one line that was wrong, the way a proofreader's eye finds the only misspelling on a page. He never said anything about it. He just stopped, and then he kept walking. Plant a thing like that in a room full of experts, and they will explain it to themselves 100 ways before they explain it the true one. There were other small tells for anyone counting. He could tell which of the building's 40-odd electrical circuits was failing by the specific way a fluorescent tube hesitated before it caught. He repaired a jammed badge reader once by listening to it, the way a piano tuner listens, his head tilted, his hands still. The younger technicians had a private theory that he was a washed-up engineer who had cracked up somewhere and come down in the world. And they were half right, and the wrong half was the only half that mattered. He let them think it. Being underestimated was the closest thing to peace he had found in 15 years, and he had learned not to disturb it. At night after Nora slept, he read. Not novels, papers, mostly, the kind posted by people who built things for the love of it and gave the building away for free. He never commented and never posted. He just read and kept reading, the way a retired sailor keeps watching the weather. Sarah used to tease him that he couldn't stop being good at the thing, even after the thing had broken his heart. Why, she had been right about that, the way she had been right about most things. And he kept reading partly because it was the last argument they would never finish. Ouija's Sentinel occupied a 14-story tower on the north end of the city, all glass and brushed steel, with a lobby that smelled faintly of cold air and money. The company had been founded 31 years earlier by a man named Edmund Aldrich, an engineer of the old school who believed that security was a public trust before it was a product. Under Edmund, the firm had grown into one of the 3 largest private security infrastructure companies in North America, with 1,140 employees, a client roster that included regional banks and 2 national hospital networks, and a flagship product, the Sentinel server architecture that protected, at any given moment, the records of roughly 19 million people. Edmund Aldrich had died of a stroke at his desk 4 years earlier. The company passed to his daughter, Diana, who was 36 and had spent most of her adult life deliberately not working for her father, building instead a respectable career in corporate law before the obligation of his death pulled her into a chair she had never asked to sit in. Diana was not a fool, and she was not cruel. She was a careful, exacting person who had inherited an institution she only half understood, and she knew it, and the knowing made her cautious in a way that sometimes read from the outside as weakness. The man who exploited that caution best was Marcus Vance. Marcus was 49, the chief executive Edmund had hired in his last years and never quite trusted, and he ran Aegis Sentinel with the polished confidence of a man who had never been wrong in a room he controlled. He had cut the maintenance and legacy security budget by 31% in his first 18 months and called it discipline. He gave a great deal of credit to himself and a great deal of blame to the market. He believed, sincerely and without irony, that his judgment was the most valuable asset the company owned, and he protected that belief the way other men protect their children. It was Marcus who had stood on a stage 11 months earlier in front of 400 clients and called the new Sentinel architecture mathematically unbreakable. The phrase tested well. He used it everywhere after that. The engineers who had to maintain the thing winced every time, because no one who actually builds these systems ever says unbreakable. They say not yet broken, but Marcus liked the word, and at Aegis Sentinel, what Marcus liked tended to become true on the slides if nowhere else. The breach hit on a Friday night at 11:48 p.m., which is when these things always hit, because the people who write ransomware understand that weekends are when the experts go home. It came in quietly, and it did not announce itself for almost 2 hours. By the time the on-call engineer noticed, the primary Sentinel cluster, the master server that brokered access for the entire client base, had been encrypted file by file from the inside, its data scrambled into noise. Every record sealed behind a wall of cryptography that would take longer than the age of the universe to break by force. On the administrative console, in plain white text on black, sat a message demanding payment in cryptocurrency within 7 days, with a countdown and a single taunting line. "We used the door you left open." By Saturday morning, Marcus had called in everyone. The war room on the 11th floor, filled with the best people the company had and several it borrowed. 20 engineers in total, each one expensive, each one certain. They attacked the problem the way well-funded teams attack everything, with tools. They ran automated decryption suites that cost more per year than most of them made. They threw the encrypted volumes at cloud clusters. They tried to isolate the malware, reverse it, and bargain it open. Every attempt failed the same way, and the way it failed was the genuinely frightening part. The ransomware had a watchdog, a small, patient process that did nothing most of the time, but woke up the instant anyone tried to touch the encryption from the network. And when it woke up, it relocked everything that had been pried loose and spread a little further into the backups. The thing was alive in the worst sense. It was not just a lock. It was a lock that fought back, and the harder 20 brilliant people pushed on it, the more it took. Here is the truth. The room did not want to say out loud. Their entire toolkit assumed they could reach the problem over the network. And the network was exactly where the enemy was strongest. They were trying to defuse a bomb by hitting it with a hammer, faster and faster, and calling the speed progress. Somewhere below the noise of all that expensive effort was a simpler question nobody had stopped long enough to ask. By Saturday afternoon, the mood had curdled into something worse than panic, which is competence with nowhere to go. The engineers understood intellectually that modern encryption is not a wall you climb, but a wall the universe itself will not let you climb in time. A key of the right length is not slow to break. It is impossible to break, in the literal sense that the sun will burn out first. So they had stopped trying to break it and started trying to negotiate with the malware, to reverse it, to find a flaw in its logic. Every probe over the wire woke the watchdog. Every awakening cost them more ground. 2 of the borrowed engineers had quietly begun drafting the internal memo that recommended paying the ransom, because paying was at least an action. And a room full of brilliant people will choose the wrong action over no action almost every time. The countdown on the admin console did not blink. It simply counted the way a thing counts that has all the time in the world and knows you do not. Leo was in the building that Saturday because the breach had triggered a hard shutdown of the climate control in the server room and the building's legacy environmental controller, a beige box installed years before Marcus arrived. The kind of thing facilities people inherit and quietly keep alive had thrown a fault that no one on the engineering floor knew how to clear. Leo had been called in on his day off. He had no childcare on a Saturday with 9 hours' notice. So Nora came with him in her good shoes, with her notebook and 3 pencils, under strict instructions to draw quietly in a chair by the wall. He cleared the controller fault in 12 minutes. He could have left. But the server room shared a glass wall with the war room, and as he coiled his cable, he glanced through it at the largest monitor, at the dense, Scrolling log, the engineers kept cycling through, looking for a way in, and his eyes did the thing they always did. They went down the column at one steady speed, and they stopped. He stood there longer than a facilities tech had any business standing. Walter Briggs noticed. Walter was 61, the oldest engineer at Aegis, a man who had been hired by Edmund himself and who had survived 4 reorganizations by being too useful to fire and too quiet to threaten anyone. He saw the gray-shirted contractor staring at the failure log, and he saw where the man's eyes had stopped, and something in Walter's face changed and then carefully went still. Marcus saw none of that. What Marcus saw was a maintenance worker loitering at the glass with a child in the corner on the worst day of the company's history, and it offended him. He came out into the corridor. "This is a restricted floor," he said. "Take your kid and your toolbox and go." "There's a hard-coded credential in your access layer," Leo said. He said it the way a person reads a street sign aloud, without weight. "Line 9 in that log." The malware didn't break in, it logged in. Someone left a maintenance account, active with a static password, and it's still the door it's holding open. For 1 second, the corridor was very quiet. Then Marcus laughed, because the alternative to laughing was taking it seriously, and taking it seriously was not available to him in front of his own engineers. "We pay people with doctorates to think about that," he said. "What do you run, exactly? That?" He nodded at the messenger bag, at the corner of yellowed plastic showing through the flap. "That thing couldn't load a weather page. But please, show the room what a $40 relic can do." A few of the engineers smiled, because the boss had smiled. Leo did not. He looked at Marcus for a moment with an expression that gave away nothing, and then he crouched down to Nora's level and tucked a loose pencil back into her hand. "Come on," he told her gently. "We're done here." He had turned to go when Walter Briggs said, from the doorway of the war room, in a voice that had not raised itself in 20 years, "Mr. Vance, let him look." They let him look for the worst possible reason, because they were out of better ideas, and because Walter Briggs, who never spoke, had spoken. Marcus framed it as a joke he was allowing to continue. Diana Aldrich, watching from the head of the table, said nothing, which everyone read as permission. Leo set Nora in a chair where he could see her and opened the messenger bag. The laptop that came out of it drew a few more smirks, and then it stopped drawing them because of what Leo did next. He did not try to join the network. He did not open any of the expensive tools. He reached into a side pocket and pulled out a thin cable with a connector none of the younger engineers recognized on sight. A 9-pin serial plug, the kind of port that had vanished from laptops 15 years ago and survived only on industrial equipment, and the machines old enough to remember it. He walked to the locked server's management panel, found the slim service port near the power supply that no one ever used, and plugged the 2 machines together by wire. "What is that?" one of the engineers said. "Not quite question. It's a back road," Leo said, watching his screen, where plain text in a single color had begun to scroll. "You've all been trying to reach this thing through the front of the house, where the malware lives. Every server like this has a second way in, a management layer underneath the operating system. For when the operating system is gone, it doesn't speak to the network. It speaks over a wire slowly in text. The thing holding your data hostage was written to fight a modern stack, your services, your software, your network. It doesn't even know this little machine exists. Because this little machine isn't running anything it was built to attack." He glanced at Nora without quite turning his head. "You remember what I told you about the toaster?" he said. The engineers stared. Nora nodded, solemn. "The fancy one breaks because it's full of things that can break. The plain one keeps working because there's nothing in it to go wrong. Simple isn't weak, kiddo. Sometimes simple is the only thing left standing. What he was doing under the calm was real and exact. Working through the management console, he pulled a snapshot of the server's live memory, the working state of the machine frozen in place, and began to read it the way the rest of the room read English. He was not trying to break the encryption. He was looking for the people who had built it, because the people who build these things almost always make one mistake, and the mistake is almost always the same. They have to hold the key in memory while they lock the door, and a sloppy lock does not clean up after itself. He worked without hurry, and the lack of hurry was its own kind of authority. He explained as he went, half to Walter and half to the room, in a flat, patient voice that never once condescended. "Good lock," he said, "throws its key away the instant it's done with it, overwrites the memory, scrubs it, leaves nothing behind. Lazy lock doesn't bother, because cleaning up takes effort, and the people who write ransomware are paid by the speed of the break, not the elegance of it." He had seen this exact laziness before, years ago, in 100 different forms, and he knew where to look the way a tracker knows which way the grass is bent. He carved the memory snapshot into regions, ruled out the ones that held only the operating system's ordinary traffic, and narrowed in on the small, warm corner where a working key would still be sitting if no one had swept it away. "There," he said, 26 minutes in. The room had gone silent enough to hear the building's air handlers. Whoever wrote this used a weak way of generating their key, and they never wiped it from memory after they finished encrypting. It's still here. It's been sitting in the machine's own memory this whole time. You don't have to break the lock. He looked up for the first time. You just have to read the key they left on the table. One of the senior engineers, a careful woman who had spent the whole day at the far end of the table saying little, leaned forward and said, very quietly, "That shouldn't have worked. That can't be it." She was not being hostile. She was being honest, which is rarer. Leo turned the screen toward her so she could see it for herself, and walked her through the steps without a trace of triumph. Wan watched the disbelief on her face turn slowly into something closer to grief, the particular grief of a professional realizing that the answer had been sitting under the whole room's expensive effort for 7 days as plain as a key on a table, waiting for someone willing to be still. Falling dust would have made a sound in that room. Nobody breathed. On Leo's yellowed screen, a single line of characters resolved out of the noise. The decryption key, recovered not by force but by attention, the one thing 20 people with better tools had been moving too fast to find. He gave it to them. That is the part that mattered, and the part Marcus could never afterward forgive. Leo did not unlock the server himself and claim the victory. He read out the key, and he walked Walter through where it lived, and how to apply it through their own systems, so that the recovery would be done by Aegis, hands on Aegis equipment, clean and documented. By 4:30 that afternoon, the master server was decrypting, record by record, the noise turning back into 19 million people's lives. By evening, the countdown clock was meaningless. The $41, 6 million YAL in frozen contracts thawed. The crisis, which had been certain to end the company, simply ended instead. And then Marcus Vance did the thing that men like Marcus always do when the danger passes and the credit is suddenly worth having. He took it. By Monday, the internal account had been rewritten. The story that went to the board and then carefully to a trade reporter was that the Aegis engineering team, under the CEO's direction, identified a memory-resident key artifact and executed a clean recovery. There was no contractor in that story. There was no serial cable and no yellowed laptop and no 7-year-old drawing in the corner. When Walter raised it in a meeting, Marcus explained, with the patience of a man correcting a child, that an unvetted outside contractor had been allowed to touch protected client data on the worst day in company history, that this was a serious compliance failure, and that the responsible thing, the disciplined thing, was to terminate the contract immediately and make sure it never appeared in any record. Diana Aldrich signed the termination. She did it on a Tuesday under pressure, with the company's lawyers telling her that an outsider's access to regulated data was a genuine liability and that the cleanest path was to close the door behind him. She told herself it was procedure. She told herself it was fair. She did not look closely at the man's file, because looking closely would have made the easy thing hard. And she was very tired, and the easy thing was right there. Leo received the call at 6:18 on Tuesday evening, while he was stirring 1 spoon of brown sugar into oatmeal he was making for dinner, because Nora liked breakfast at night. The voice from the staffing agency was apologetic and vague. His contract was concluded, effective immediately. There would be no further assignments at Aegis Sentinel. He said he understood. He thanked the man for calling. He hung up, and he finished stirring the oatmeal, and he set 2 bowls on the table. And when Nora asked if he was still going to fix the building with the cold thermostat, he said, "Somebody else will get a turn now." And he meant it kindly, and it cost him more than he let her see. The thing about a buried truth is that someone always knows where the shovel is. Walter Briggs had known since the moment Leo's eyes stopped on line 9 of that log. He had recognized it the way you recognize a handwriting. 20 years earlier, when Walter was a younger engineer and Edmund Aldrich's company was still small and hungry, Aegis had acquired a struggling 2-person startup that had built something remarkable. A security protocol elegant enough that the rest of the architecture could be built on top of it. The protocol had a name then. It had an author. And it had, woven into its diagnostic layer, an undocumented maintenance function, a deliberate back road for the people who maintained the system, meant to be locked and rotated and watched. The author was Leo Calloway. He had built it with his co-founder, who would later become his wife. Walter went looking quietly, the way careful old men do. He pulled the original acquisition records out of an archive. Marcus did not know still existed, because Marcus had not been there and assumed the past began when he did. He found the founding design documents, with Leo's name on every page. He found something else too, a memo 15 years old, from Leo to the company that bought him, flagging that the maintenance function in the protocol was being left active with a static credential during the rushed integration, that it was a serious vulnerability, and that it had to be secured before the product shipped. The memo had a received stamp. It had no reply. It had been buried. And the reason it had been buried, Walter learned, and was tangled and human and ugly. The integration had been rushed because the acquisition had been rushed, and the acquisition had been rushed because Leo's co-founder, Sarah, had been sick. When the company had structured the deal to close, while the 2 founders were distracted by a hospital, stripping their names from the long-term rights, in fine print they signed at the worst moment of their lives, and then quietly shelving the inconvenient warning that would have slowed the launch. Leo had filed his report. The report had cost him his standing, then his role, then any place in the industry, because a man who embarrasses the people who just bought him does not get hired again. He had walked away to take care of his wife, and, later, his daughter, and he had let the world believe he was no one, because the world had made it very clear it preferred him that way. There was a final page in the file that Walter sat with for a long time before he could bring himself to carry it upstairs. was a single internal email, 14 years old, between two executives who no longer worked at the company, discussing what to do about the Callaway problem. One of them had written, in the plain language people use when they are certain no one will ever read it, that the warning memo was technically correct but commercially inconvenient, and that the cleanest fix was to let the cretin ride until a quieter quarter, and then never get to that quarter. They had decided, in 2 sentences over lunch, to leave a door open in the foundation of a product that would go on to guard 19 million people's records, because closing it that week would have cost a launch date. 15 years later, someone with bad intentions had found the same door and walked through it. The man who had begged them to close it had been escorted out of the building for closing it himself. The static credential he had warned about 15 years earlier was the exact door the ransomware walked through. Walter brought all of it: the design documents, the unanswered memo, the acquisition file, a photograph from the original founding announcement showing 2 young people standing in front of a whiteboard, covered in the protocol's first diagram, and he laid it on Diana Aldrich's desk, and he said, "You fired the man who wrote the thing we sell. He told us about this whole 15 years ago. We punished him for it then, and we fired him for fixing it now." Then the oldest engineer in the company, who had kept this secret out of respect for a man who never asked him to, said the only thing left to say. "Your father would have known his name on sight. I think somewhere he did." Diana did not defend herself, and that was the first true sign of who she actually was. She read every page. She matched the handwriting on the memo to the design documents. She matched the diagram in the 15-year-old photograph to the architecture diagram that hung, framed and proud, in the lobby of her own building, and she saw that they were the same drawing, aged apart. When she sat with it for a long time, then she began, carefully and without theater, to make it right, not because it was good for the company, but because it was true, and she had spent 4 years being afraid of a chair when she should have been using it. Marcus, given the same documents, did the other thing. He doubled down. He called the memo unverifiable. He called the acquisition ancient history that predated his tenure and therefore his responsibility. He argued that the contractor's termination was a sound compliance decision and that revisiting it would expose the company to narrative risk. When Diana asked him directly whether he had cut the legacy security budget that would have funded the rotation of exactly the kind of credential that had been exploited, he told her that cost discipline was not a crime, and that if she wanted to run the company on sentiment, she should say so to the board. He never once said the word sorry. He could not locate it. To apologize would have required believing he had been wrong, and that belief was not a thing his mind could hold. So the consequences came, and every one of them grew from a seed Marcus had planted himself. Diana, as board chair, ordered an independent review of the breach, and the review found in writing what Leo's buried memo had found in advance. The entry point was a known, documented, 15-year-old vulnerability, flagged at the time and never remediated, left exposed by a budget cut the current CEO had personally championed and publicly praised. The mathematically unbreakable claim set beside that finding became a liability in front of the firm's regulated clients, 2 of whom had compliance obligations that did not tolerate a company that had hidden a known flaw. The hospital networks asked hard questions. A bank asked harder ones. The board did not remove Marcus in a dramatic scene. They removed him the way these things actually happen, in a closed meeting, with a vote, with a severance shaped by lawyers and a press release about a planned leadership transition. He walked out of the tower he had run for 9 years, still believing he was the smartest person who had ever worked in it, still certain the world had simply failed to appreciate his judgment, never once connecting the cut he had been proud of to the door it had left open. A man can survive almost anything except the one sentence he refuses to say. 8 months later, the lobby of Aegis Sentinel looked nearly the same, but the company inside it did not feel the same, and the people who worked there could not always say why. Diana Aldrich had spent those months doing unglamorous things. She had funded the legacy security work Marcus had cut, and then some. She had rewritten the contractor and vendor review process so that no one's name could be quietly erased from a record again. She had stood in front of the same 400 clients Marcus had once promised the impossible to, and she had retired the word unbreakable from every slide the company owned, replacing it with a sentence her father might have written: "We will tell you the truth about what we know, and the truth about what we don't." It tested worse than Marcus's word. She used it anyway, and she had found Leo Calloway, which had not been hard once she stopped, pretending she didn't know where to look. He had not gone far. He was doing contract work for a small clinic system, keeping unglamorous machines alive, picking Nora up at 3:15 every afternoon. When Diana came to him, herself, not a lawyer, not an assistant, she did not come with a check held out at arm's length the way Marcus would have. She came with the photograph from the founding announcement, the one with 2 young people and a whiteboard, and she set it on the table between them and said she was sorry, plainly, in her own voice, for what her company and her father's company had done to him and to Sarah 15 years ago and 8 months ago both. Then she made an offer. She did not offer him his old job. She understood by then that he would never want to stand inside a tower again. She offered him something that surprised her board and would have appalled Marcus. She offered to release the core of the protocol Leo had built. The elegant thing the whole company had been quietly standing on for 15 years, into the open, under a license that let anyone in the world read it, use it, waiting and harden it. Not sold, not licensed. Given away the way Sarah had once said the kindest knowledge always should be. It would cost Aegis its quiet monopoly on the best security architecture in the industry. It would also, Diana had come to believe, be the only thing that could ever truly fix the door, because a flaw that thousands of strangers can see gets closed in a week, while a flaw one company hides can sit open for 15 years and take down everything. Leo was quiet for a while. Then he asked if his name could go back on it. Diana said it already had. She had restored it to the records the day she read the memo, and the open release would carry it from the first line. They did the release on a Thursday in spring, with almost no ceremony, which was the only way Leo would agree to it. He came to the building one last time, with Nora, because she had asked to see the place where her dad's old toaster idea turned out to be the thing that saved everyone. Walter Briggs was there, retired now but unwilling to miss it, standing a little straighter than the year before. Diana pressed the button herself on Leo's say-so, and somewhere in the world a repository went public, and a 15-year-old piece of work that had been taken from a sick woman and her husband became, in an instant, the property of everyone and no one. Within a day, strangers in a dozen countries had read it, praised it, and quietly patched a class of vulnerability in their own systems they had not known they shared. The door Leo had warned about in a memo no one answered was at last closed everywhere at once. There was no fortune in it for him. He had not asked for one. Marcus, wherever he was, would never have understood that a man could win this completely and take no money. because Marcus measured victory in the one currency Leo had stopped counting in a long time ago. On the way out, Nora tugged his sleeve in the lobby and pointed up at the framed architecture diagram on the wall. The one that matched the whiteboard in the old photograph, line for line. There was a small new plaque beneath it now. She could read most of it. She sounded out the name at the bottom, her own last name, and then she looked up at her father with the uncomplicated certainty that only children and the truly free still have. "That's us," she said. It was not a question. Leo crouched down to her level the way he had in the corridor 8 months before and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "That's your mom, mostly," he said, "and it belongs to everybody now. That's the part she'd have liked best." He took her hand. They walked out through the glass doors into the ordinary afternoon. A man in a worn jacket and a girl with a notebook carrying a yellowed laptop and nothing they needed to prove, and the most expensive room in the building stayed quiet behind them, having finally learned the only thing it had ever needed to know. That the measure of a person is never the tool in their hands, but the way they choose to use what they carry and what they choose to give away. I keep coming back to the quietest moment in this story. Not the recovered key, but the man finishing the oatmeal after the call that fired him, setting out 2 bowls, saying nothing to his daughter that would frighten her. We tend to think dignity is something you assert. I think it's mostly something you protect, in small rooms, when no one is watching, and no one would blame you for letting it go. If this story asks anything of us, it's to look again at the people we've decided are no one, and to remember that the most valuable thing a person knows is often the thing they're never asked about. Give your knowledge away when you can. It's the only kind of wealth that grows when you spend it. Disclaimer. This is a fictional dramatization written to explore a human truth, not a report of real events. Any resemblance to actual people, companies, or incidents is entirely coincidental.